Who is Golda Meir and what were his achievements from the beginning until her death? Part 2. Golda Meir, the Iron Lady of Israel, a remarkable life. Today, we're diving into the extraordinary life of a woman who left an indelible mark on history. Golda Meir, often referred to as the Iron Lady of Israel, will explore her early life, her role in the founding of Israel, and her impactful years as Israel's prime minister. Golda Meir was born on May 3, 1898, in Kiev, Ukraine, which was part of the Russian Empire at the time. Her birth name was Golda Mavovich. Her family immigrated to the United States, and she grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Golda was exposed to a strong sense of community and the values that would shape her future political career. As a young woman, Golda became involved in Zionist activities, advocating for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. She married Morris Meyerson and moved to Palestine in 1921, where they helped establish a kibbutz, a collective community. Golda's political career took off during the tumultuous times leading up to the founding of Israel in 1948. She played a vital role in diplomacy and fundraising, even meeting with U.S. President Truman to secure support for the newly proposed state. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel. Golda Meir was one of the signatories of Israel's Declaration of Independence. Golda Meir's most significant impact came when she became Israel's fourth prime minister in 1969, making her the world's third female head of government. During her tenure, she navigated through challenging times, such as the Munich Olympics massacre and the Yom Kippur War. Her leadership was marked by a no-nonsense approach, earning her the nickname, the Iron Lady. Golda Meir retired from politics in 1974 and passed away in 1978. Her legacy endures as an iconic figure in Israeli history, and she remains an inspiration for women in leadership around the world. Golda Meir's life is a testament to the power of determination and leadership. She rose from humble beginnings to shape the history of a nation and inspire generations to come. Now let's start talking in a little detail. While in Milwaukee, she embraced the labor Zionist movement. In 1921, Meir and her husband emigrated to Mandatory Palestine, settling in Merhavia, later becoming the kibbutz's representative to the Histadrut. In 1934, she was elevated to the executive committee of the trade union. Meir held several key roles in the Jewish Agency during and after World War II. She was a signatory of the Israeli Declaration of Independence in 1948. Meir was elected to the Knesset in 1949 and served as labor minister until 1956, when she was appointed foreign minister by Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. She retired from the ministry in 1966 due to ill health. In 1969, Meir assumed the role of prime minister following the death of Levi Eshkol. Early in her tenure, she made multiple diplomatic visits to Western leaders to promote her vision of peace in the region. The outbreak of the Yom Kippur War in 1973 caught Israel off guard and inflicted severe early losses on the army. A controversial figure in Israel, Meir has been lionized as a founder of the state and described as the Iron Lady of Israeli politics, but also widely blamed for the country being caught by surprise during the War of 1973. In addition, her dismissive statements towards the Palestinians were widely scorned. Most historians believe Meir was more successful as Secretary of Labor and Housing than as Premier. Meir's father, Moshe, left the country to find work in New York City in 1903. In his absence, the rest of the family moved to Pinsk, present-day Belarus, to join her mother's family. In 1905, Moshe moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in search of higher-paying work, and found employment in the workshops of the local railroad yard. The following year, he had saved up enough money to bring his family to the United States. Golda, along with her mother and sisters, landed in Quebec and traveled to Milwaukee by train. Meir's mother ran a grocery store on Milwaukee's north side. By age 8, Meir was often put in charge of watching the store when her mother went to buy supplies. She attended the 4th Street Grade School, now Golda Meir School, from 1906 to 1912. A leader early on, she and a close friend, Regina Hamburger, organized the American Young Sisters Society, a fundraiser to pay for her classmates' textbooks in 1908. As part of the organization's activities, she rented a hall and scheduled a public meeting for the event. Despite frequent tardiness due to having to work in her mother's store, she graduated as valedictorian of her class. In 1912, she began studying at North Division High School and worked part-time. Her employers included Schuster's department store and the Milwaukee Public Library. Her mother wanted Golda to leave school and marry, but she declined. On the 17th of February 1913, Meir took a train to live with her married sister, Shana Korngold, in Denver, Colorado. The Korngolds held intellectual evenings at their home, where Meir was exposed to debates on Zionism, literature, women's suffrage, trade unionism, and more. In her autobiography, she wrote, "To the extent that my own future convictions were shaped and given form, those talk-filled nights in Denver played a considerable role." She attended the Teachers College Milwaukee State Normal School, now University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, in 1916, and likely part of 1917. In 1917, she took a position at a Yiddish-speaking Volksschule in Milwaukee. There, she further embraced labor Zionism. On the 9th of July 1917, Golda became a naturalized U.S. citizen, as her father had naturalized. And at that time, children of naturalized citizens under the age of 21 received citizenship by descent. On the 24th of December 1917, Meir and Meirson married. However, Meir's precondition for marriage was to settle in Palestine. She had intended to make Aliyah immigration to Israel straight away, but her plans were disrupted when all transatlantic passenger services were canceled due to the entry of the United States into the First World War. She then threw her energies into pro-Zion activities. A short time after their wedding, she embarked on a fundraising campaign for pro-Zion that took her across the United States. In 1921, after the conclusion of the war, the couple moved to Palestine, then part of the British Mandate, along with Meir's sister Shana, Shana's daughter, and Meir's childhood friend Regina. They sailed on the SS Pocahontas from New York to Naples, then from there to Tel Aviv by train. Meir's parents subsequently moved to Palestine in 1926. They were eventually accepted into Kibbutz Merhavia in the Jezreel Valley after an initial rejected application. Her duties included picking almonds, planting trees, working in the chicken coops, and running the kitchen. Recognizing her leadership abilities, the kibbutz chose her as its representative to the Histadrut, the General Federation of Labor. In 1924, the couple left the kibbutz and lived briefly in Tel Aviv before settling in Jerusalem. There, they had 2 children, a son Menachem in 1924 and a daughter Sarah in 1926. Meir returned to Merhavia for a brief period in 1925. In 1928, Meir was elected secretary of Motzid HaPolat Working Women's Council. She spent 2 years, 1,932,193 for in the United States as an emissary for the organization and to get expert medical treatment for her daughter's kidney illness. In 1934, when Meir returned from the United States, she joined the executive committee of the Histadrut and moved up the ranks to become the head of its political department. This appointment was important training for her future role in Israeli leadership. In July 1938, Meir was the Jewish observer from Palestine at the Evian Conference, called by President Franklin D. Roosevelt of the United States to discuss the question of Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi persecution. Delegates from the 32 invited countries repeatedly expressed their sorrow for the plight of the European Jews, but refused to admit the refugees. The only exception was the Dominican Republic, which pledged to accept 100,000 refugees on generous terms. Meir was disappointed at the outcome, and she remarked to the press, "There is only one thing I hope to see before I die, and that is that my people should not need expressions of sympathy anymore." Throughout World War II, Meir served several key roles in the Jewish Agency, which functioned as the government of British Palestine. In June 1946, Meir became acting head of the political department of the Jewish Agency after the British arrested Moshe Sharett and other leaders of the Yishuv as part of Operation Agatha. This was a critical moment in her career. She became the principal negotiator between the Jews in Palestine and the British Mandatory Authority. After his release, Sharett went to the United States to attend talks on the Unpartitioned Plan, leaving Meir to head the political department until the establishment of the state in 1948. In 1947, she traveled to Cyprus to meet Jewish detainees of the Cyprus internment camps, who had been interned by the British after being caught trying to illegally enter Palestine, and persuade them to give priority to families with children to fill the small quota of detainees allowed into Palestine. She was largely successful in this task. For most of the war, Meir reluctantly played what she felt was a minor role in Israel's activities. An article published by the Golda Meir Institute said she felt she was being pushed aside to a secondary arena. However, she played a critical role in fundraising. In January 1948, the Jewish Agency needed to raise funds for the continuing war and the coming Israeli state. The treasurer of the Jewish Agency was convinced that they would not be able to raise more than $7 to $8 million from the American Jewish community. Meir raised over $30 million. Key to her success was an emotional speech she first delivered in Chicago on the 22nd of January. She toured dozens of cities in the United States and returned to Israel on the 18th of March. The funds were critical to the success of the war effort and the establishment of Israel. By comparison, the opposing Arab Higher Committee's annual budget was around $2.25 million, similar to Haganah's annual budget before the war. Ben-Gurion wrote that Meir's role as the Jewish woman who got the money which made the state possible would go down in history. However, upon returning home, she suffered a political setback. The Jewish Agency and National Council executives excluded her from the 13-member cabinet of the Provisional Government of Israel and only included her in the 37-member People's Council. Ben-Gurion protested this, saying it is inconceivable that there shall be no adequate woman. It is a moral and political necessity for the Yishuv, the Jewish world, and the Arab world. At one point, he even considered offering her his spot on the cabinet. On the 13th of April, she was hospitalized in Tel Aviv due to a suspected heart attack. Ben-Gurion and the political department heads urged her to guard her health and come to Jerusalem as soon as she could. They asked her to be the mother of this city, and that her words to 100,000 residents will be a source of blessing and encouragement. However, she felt it was a secondary and temporary role. Instead, on the 6th of May, she visited Haifa after its the 22nd of April occupation by Hagan. This trip had a significant impact on her. There, she witnessed an elderly Arab woman emerging from a destroyed house, clutching to her few remaining belongings. When the two women made eye contact, they burst into tears. Meir went on to call the mass expulsion and flight of Arabs before the 1948 Palestine War dreadful, and likened it to what befell the Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe. She returned to Tel Aviv, and eventually to Jerusalem 2 weeks before the end of the mandate. On the 10th of May, Meir had a second meeting with Abdullah as she traveled to Amman in secret, disguised as an Arab woman. He proposed that Palestine be absorbed into Jordan, with autonomy granted to majority Jewish areas. Golda rejected the proposal. It then seemed likely that Abdullah I would invade. On the 14th of May 1948, Meir became one of 24 signatories, including 2 women of the Israeli Declaration of Independence. She later recalled, "After I signed, I cried. When I studied American history as a schoolgirl and I read about those who signed the U.S. Declaration of Independence, I couldn't imagine these were real people doing something real. And there I was sitting down and signing a declaration of establishment." A day after independence, the second phase of the war began. Meir also suddenly lost her job and administrative responsibilities, as the political department became the Provisional Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and her leadership role in Jerusalem was taken over by Dov Yosef. On the 18th of May, she embarked on a second and even more successful fundraising tour in which she raised around $50 million. In total, her fundraising efforts raised around $90 million, around a third of the cost of the war, $275 million. During preparations for this trip, she was issued the first Israeli passport. Over the 10 weeks that she was gone, Israel was battered by the war and changed drastically. On the 25th of June, while still in the United States, Meir was appointed by Sherrod, then the Minister of Foreign Affairs, as the Minister Plenipotentiary to the Soviet Union, which recently recognized Israel. Meir was displeased by the offer. She spoke no Russian and feared being lonely in Moscow. She said, "At last we have a state. I want to be there. I don't want to go thousands of miles away. Why do I always have to go away?" Her return to Israel was delayed due to a car crash in which she tore a ligament and fractured a bone. Soviet officials refused to believe she was in hospital and wanted an Israeli envoy as soon as possible. Thus, she ignored doctors' orders to rest and returned to Israel on the 29th of July. Years later, her leg would frequently pain her. Meir served as Minister Plenipotentiary to the Soviet Union from the 2nd of September 1948 to the 10th of March 1949. She was reportedly impatient with diplomatic niceties and using interpreters. She did not drink or ballroom dance and had little interest in gossip and fashion. According to her interpreter, when asked by a Russian ambassador how she traveled to Moscow, she responded, "Tell His Excellency the ambassador that we arrived riding on donkeys." This was an important and difficult role. Good relations with the Soviet Union impacted Israel's ability to secure arms from Eastern European countries. In turn, Joseph Stalin and Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov saw its relationship with Israel as a means of furthering the Soviet position in the Middle East. However, Soviet-Israeli relations were complicated by Soviet policies against religious institutions and nationalist movement, made manifest in actions to shut down Jewish religious institutions, as well as the ban on Hebrew language study, and the prohibition of promoting emigration to Israel. Just 20 days after her term began, anti-Semitic crackdowns began in response to an article by Soviet Jewish writer Ilya Ehrenberg. Meir and the other Israeli representatives responded by making a point of visiting Russian Jewish businesses, synagogues, and performances. On the 3rd of October, during Rosh Hashanah celebrations at the Moscow Choral Synagogue, she was mobbed by thousands of Russian Jews chanting in Russian Nasha Golda, meaning our Golda. In her autobiography, she said, "I felt as though I had been caught up in a torrent of love so strong that it had literally taken my breath away and slowed down my heart." This event was commemorated by the Israeli 10,000 shekel banknote issued in November 1984. It bore a portrait of Meir on one side and the image of the crowd greeting her in Moscow on the other. To her close friends, she admitted she had little to do in Moscow and felt isolated from Israeli politics. Despite being a socialist that was born in Ukraine, her Jewish side caused friction with the Soviets that made progress difficult. By the end of her term, she felt she had accomplished little. She reportedly felt guilty for not achieving more for the Russian Jews, as she would have been in their situation if her father had not moved to the United States. She planned to run for the first Knesset elections on the 25th of January 1949. The month before the elections, she returned to Israel and campaigned for Mapai. Mapai won 35% of the votes and formed a coalition, and Ben-Gurion invited her into the cabinet. She was sworn in on the 8th of March and continued to serve in the Knesset until 1974. Ben-Gurion initially offered Meir the position of deputy prime minister, which she rejected. She found the title and responsibilities vague and disliked the idea of needing to coordinate with so many government departments. Instead, she took the role of labor minister, which she held from the 10th of March 1949 to the 19th of June 1956. Meir enjoyed this role much more than her previous, calling it her 7 beautiful years. In particular, she enjoyed the ability to act quickly and with little friction from others. She was also one of the most powerful Israeli politicians at the time. The main source of friction in the role was funding, especially to deal with the millions of immigrants arriving in the new state. In October 1950, Meir announced in Washington a 3-year plan for Israel's development and stated a price tag of $15 billion over the next 15 years. The Israeli government managed to secure a loan from the United States government and American Jews that secured 40% of the budget. The newly created Israel bonds only provided a small amount, although years later they would contribute billions to the Israeli economy. Meir assisted in building over 100 Ma'abarot temporary immigrant camps with crude tin-roofed huts and tents for housing. She drew criticism from many new immigrants and contemporary politicians due to this, but responded by pointing to her limited budget and the time needed to construct proper housing. In 1953, she assisted in an effort to eliminate the Ma'abarot. By 1956, 2/3 were eliminated, and 120,000 families moved to permanent housing. Meir considered herself highly productive during this period. She carried out welfare state policies, orchestrated the integration of immigrants into Israel's workforce, and introduced major housing and road construction projects. From 1949 to 1956, 200,000 apartments and 30,000 houses were built, large industrial and agricultural developments were initiated, and new hospitals, schools, and roads were built. Despite the complaints of her colleagues in the finance ministry, Meir worked to establish Social Security, maternity benefits, work-related accident insurance, benefits to widows and orphans, and even burial costs. In 1954, she sided with Ben-Gurion against Pinchas Lavon in the Lavon affair. In the summer of 1955, Meir reluctantly ran for the position of mayor of Tel Aviv on request of her party. At the time, mayors were elected by the city council and not directly. She lost by the 2 votes of the religious bloc, who withheld their support on the grounds that she was a woman. While angered by the sexism she encountered, she was happy to rejoin her colleagues in the cabinet. On the 3rd of August 1955, she was again hospitalized after complaining of chest pains, and was diagnosed with arrhythmia. In October 1955, Ben-Gurion appointed Meir as foreign minister, replacing Sherrod. Meir planned and coordinated with the French government and military prior to the start of the invasion. During United Nations debates about the crisis, Meir took charge of the Israeli delegation. After the fighting started, the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Nations forced the 3 invaders to withdraw. As foreign minister, Meir promoted ties with the newly established states in Africa in an effort to gain allies in the international community. She also believed that Israel had experience in nation building that could be a model for the Africans. In her autobiography, she wrote, she also devoted much effort to convincing the United States to sell Israel weaponry. One success in this area came in 1962, when the White House quietly agreed to sell Hawk missiles to Israel. Israel's relationship with the Soviet Union remained frosty during her tenure. On the 29th of October 1957, Meir's foot was slightly injured when a Mills bomb was thrown into the debating chamber of the Knesset. David Ben-Gurion and Moshe Carmel were more seriously injured. The attack was carried out by 25-year-old Moshe Dweck. Born in Aleppo, his motives were attributed to a dispute with the Jewish Agency, but he was described as being mentally unbalanced. In 1958, Meir praised Pope Pius XII's assistance of the Jewish people shortly after his death. The Pontiff's legacy as a wartime pope has continued to be controversial into the 21st century. The same year, during the wave of Jewish migration from Poland to Israel, Meir sought to prevent disabled and sick Polish Jews from immigrating to Israel. In a letter sent to Israel's ambassador in Warsaw, Catriel Katz, she wrote, a proposal was raised in the Coordination Committee to inform the Polish government that we want to institute selection in Aliyah, because we cannot continue accepting sick and handicapped people. Please give your opinion as to whether this can be explained to the Poles without hurting immigration. In late 1965, 67-year-old Meir was diagnosed with lymphoma. In January 1966, she retired from her role as foreign minister, citing exhaustion and ill health, although she continued to serve in the Knesset and as Secretary General of MAPI. During the 1960s, Meir lived in a flat on the upper level of a house that was once known as Villa Harun al-Rashid. The house was built in 1926 by Hannah Bisharat and later rented to British officers. The house was later given to Zionist militias due to the prominent view from the roof. According to Hannah Bisharat's grandson George Bisharat, Meir had the tiles on the house's front sandblasted to obliterate the Villa Harun al-Rashid and thereby conceal the fact that she was living in an Arab home. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol died suddenly on the 26th of February 1969, leading to the appointment of Yigal Allon as interim prime minister and an election to replace him. Before the vote, most suspected that Meir would be elected. On the 7th of March 1969, the party's Central Committee voted Meir as the new party leader. 71-year-old Meir had mixed feelings due to her health concerns, but eventually agreed, saying that she would honor the party's decision just as she had honored all of the party's past decisions. Meir served as prime minister from the 17th of March 1969 to the 3rd of June 1974. She maintained the national unity government formed in 1967 after the Six-Day War, in which MAPI merged with two other parties. Rafi and Adaha voted to form the Israeli Labor Party. 6 months after taking office, Meir led the reconfigured alignment, comprising Labor and MAPAM, into the 1969 general election. The alignment managed what is still the best showing for a single party or faction in Israeli history, winning 56 seats. This is the only time that a party or faction has approached winning an outright majority in an election. The national unity government was retained. In 1969 and the early 1970s, Meir met with many world leaders to promote her peace settlement idea, including Richard Nixon 1969. Nicolae Ceausescu 1972 and Pope Paul VI 1973. In 1973, she hosted the Chancellor of West Germany, Willy Brandt, in Israel. In August 1970, Meir accepted a U.S. peace initiative that called for an end to the war of attrition and an Israeli pledge to withdraw to secure and recognized boundaries in the framework of a comprehensive peace settlement. The Gahal Party quit the national unity government in protest, but Meir continued to lead the remaining coalition. In June 1969, on the 2-year anniversary of the Six-Day War, Meir stated in an interview that there was no such thing as Palestinians, a comment later described by Al Jazeera as one of her defining and most damning legacies. This phrase is considered to be the most famous example of Israeli denial of Palestinian identity. The interview, entitled "Who Can Blame Israel?" was published in the Sunday Times on June 15, 1969. And included the following exchange. Frank Giles: do you think the emergence of the Palestinian Fighting Forces, the Fedayeen, is an important new factor in the Middle East? Golda Meir: important? No. A new factor? Yes. There was no such thing as Palestinians. When was there an independent Palestinian people with a Palestinian state? It was either southern Syria before the First World War, and then it was a Palestine including Jordan. It was not as though there was a Palestinian people in Palestine considering itself as a Palestinian people and we came and threw them out and took their country from them. They did not exist. In the wake of the Munich massacre at the 1972 Summer Olympics, Meir appealed to the world to save our citizens and condemned the unspeakable criminal acts committed. Outraged at the perceived lack of global action, she ordered the Mossad to hunt down and assassinate suspected leaders and operatives of Black September and the PFLP. During the 1970s, about 200,000 Soviet Jewish immigrants were allowed to leave the Soviet Union for Israel by way of Austria. When 7 of these immigrants were taken hostage at the Austria-Czechoslovakia border by Palestinian militants in September 1973, the Chancellor of Austria, Bruno Kreisky, closed the Jewish Agency's transit facility in Skonau, Austria. A few days later in Vienna, Meir tried to convince Kreisky to reopen the facility by appealing to his own Jewish origin, and described his position as succumbing to terrorist blackmail. Kreisky did not change his position, so Meir returned to Israel, infuriated. A few months later, Austria opened a new transition camp. A common criticism of Meir is that she could have avoided the Yom Kippur War in 1973. For months preceding the attack, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat made repeated overtures for peace in exchange for a full Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai. But these gestures were rebuffed by Meir, who had offered previously to discuss ceding most of the Sinai, but was not willing to restore the pre-1967 borders, and Egypt had no interest in peace talks under Meir's conditions. As the nation's leader during this short war, her main goal was deciding on the timing of preliminary operations, and providing the IDF with the necessary time and munitions to pull off a victory. In the days leading up to the Yom Kippur War, Israeli intelligence could not conclusively determine that an attack was imminent. However, on the 5th of October 1973, Meir received information that Syrian forces were massing on the Golan Heights. She was alarmed by the reports and believed that the situation was similar to what preceded the Six-Day War. However, her advisors counseled her not to worry, saying they would have adequate notice before any war broke out. This made sense at the time. After the Six-Day War, most in the Israeli intelligence community considered the Arabs unprepared to launch another attack. Consequently, although the Knesset passed a resolution granting her power to demand a full-scale call-up of the military instead of the typical cabinet decision, Meir did not mobilize Israel's forces early. Soon, though, the threat of war became very clear. 6 hours before the outbreak of hostilities, Meir met with Minister of Defense Moshe Dayan and General David Elazar. While Dayan continued to argue that war was unlikely and favored calling up the Air Force and only 2 divisions, Elazar advocated full-scale army mobilization and the launch of a full-scale preemptive strike on Syrian forces. On October 6, Meir approved full-scale mobilizing but rejected a preemptive strike, citing concerns that Israel might be perceived as initiating hostilities, which would hurt Israel's access to crucial foreign aid and military support, in particular from the United States, in the resulting conflict. She made it a priority to inform Washington of her decision. U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger later confirmed Meir's assessment by stating that if Israel had launched a preemptive strike, Israel would not have received the backing of the United States. Following the Yom Kippur War, Meir's government was plagued by infighting and questions over Israel's lack of preparation for the war. The Agranat Commission appointed to investigate the war cleared Meir of direct responsibility. It said about her actions on Yom Kippur morning, she decided wisely, with common sense and speedily, in favor of the full mobilization of the reserves, as recommended by the Chief of Staff, despite weighty political considerations, thereby performing a most important service for the defense of the state. Her party won the elections in December 1973, but the coalition lost seats and was unable to form a majority. Meir resigned as Prime Minister on the 11th of April 1974, and gave up her Knesset seat on the 7th of June 1974. She never held office again. She believed that was the will of the people and that she had served enough time as premier. She believed the government needed to form a coalition. She said, 5 years are sufficient. It is beyond my strength to continue carrying this burden. Yitzhak Rabin succeeded her on June 3, 1974. On the 8th of December 1978, Meir died of lymphatic cancer lymphoma in Jerusalem at the age of 80. She was buried on Mount Herzl in Jerusalem. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep exploring the world's incredible stories. I stop at this point today. Thank you for watching. I hope I added something to you.